on Zoom. Shabbat Shalom. And Bahar starts with very neatly Leviticus 25, verse 1. Rabbi Jeffrey Salkin, who's a wonderful rabbi, I lost track of him. I'm not sure if he's in Florida or Atlanta these days. Some of you may be familiar with one of his popular books called Putting God on the Guest List. It was about how to make bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah experiences, more emphasis, as they say, on the mitzvah and less on the bar. But he then went on to write another book, which is really a Parshat HaShavua book for bar and bat mitzvah students and teenagers. And so it's written at a somewhat simplistic level, but commenting on Bahar, he starts by giving the students reading the book a quick quiz, which is, what is our mathematical system based on, right? And the answer, of course, is base 10. I found that when I stopped trying to clear my checkbook every month in base 8, everything got a lot better in my finances. So base 10 is what we work in. He says, but the Torah operates in base 7 because 7 is such an important number. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples of things. Some of them you come to mind already for you. Of course, Shabbat. We're sitting here on Shabbat, the 7th day of the week, a cycle of 7. And even when we expand that a little bit, a cycle of 7 is the important cycle. And of course, when does Brit Milah take place? On day 8. That represents that we've completed an entire time period, in this case, the first week of life. Tishrei is the 7th month of the year. Some of you know our Jewish calendar is a bit of a hybrid of different parts of our tradition. And so Tishrei, because the Torah tells us that Nisan is the first month of the year, Nisan, when Pesach comes and is the start of spring and the growing season and so on. If you count off with Nisan as 1, Tishrei is the 7th month of the year. And of course, Tishrei is the month with the high holy days, and then Sukol and Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. So more holidays in that month than in any other single month. The month that follows Tishrei is Cheshvan, sometimes often called Mar Cheshvan, the bitter month of Cheshvan. And they say, why is it bitter? Because Tishrei got all the holidays and Cheshvan gets no holidays. There's no holidays in Cheshvan. So it's somewhat bitter. So that's if you start counting with Nisan. But if you start counting the year, the month, the year really with Tishrei, because that's when Rosh Hashanah is, when we flip the calendar over to the new page, if you start counting it with Tishrei as 1, what month turns out to be number 7? Nisan. Isn't that convenient, right? It's nice how that works. We're going to get into the sabbatical year. That's at the heart of Parshat Bahar. And that's the 7th year. And then we have also in Bahar, we're going to talk just a little bit about this. We have a 7-year cycle. Every 7th year is the sabbatical year. We have a 7-year cycle 7 times. And that takes us to the 50th year, the Yovel, the Jubilee year. So there you have 7 times 7. Nice, what do you call it? Not a prime number. What do you call it? Square, right? 7 squared. And then, of course, that brings us to where we are right now, which is counting the Omer. Beginning the 2nd night of Pesach, we begin to count the Omer. And we do that for 7 days per week times 7 weeks, 49 days. Day 50 is Shavuot, which of course the name of the holiday comes from Sheva, 7, right? And we find ourselves on day 41 of the Omer today. So we talk about 7 weeks of the Omer. There are, if you add them up, 7 patriarchs and matriarchs combined in the book of Genesis. Pesach has 7 days. I know we celebrate 8 because we're in diaspora, but biblically and in Israel, Pesach is 7 days, and Sukkot is a 7-day holiday. Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, is essentially an 8th day, but it is actually its own little mini holiday. And so Sukkot is 7 days plus 1 day for Shemini Atzeret. Where this gets a little tricky is in diaspora communities, we have 7 days of Sukkot, 8th day Shemini Atzeret, and then the next day Simchat Torah. But of course, in Israel, Shemini Atzeret and Simchat Torah are the same day. So it's 7 plus 1. Only in diaspora is it 7 plus 1 plus 1. So gets a little confusing. So let's jump into our text. 25 verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelite people and say to them. So far, nothing particularly. What page are you on? 738. Nothing particularly unusual. When you enter the land, hold that thought. When you enter the land that I assigned to you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. And again, we just have more evidence of, our ancestors, their existence was agriculturally based. You can do that for 6 years. In the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, what the Torah calls a Shabbat Shabbaton. In case you weren't clear on what rest meant, right? In terms of a Shabbat, we say a complete rest, Shabbat Shabbaton. This, by the way, is a pretty standard biblical and Hebrew way to add emphasis. We do it in English as well, that if you repeat a word, it adds emphasis to it. And so Shabbat Shabbaton, really the same word, the same root. And so there's an emphasis here, meaning not just that the land lies fallow, but that it's a complete rest. There's many other examples of it, but the one that most stands out is in the Akedah story, the binding of Isaac story, when Abraham has the knife raised about to slaughter his son, and God calls out to him, Abraham, and then what's the next thing? Abraham, a second time. And there's always a question about how much time elapsed between the first Abraham and the second Abraham. In other words, God said Abraham because he's going to tell him not to do this terrible thing, and then he says it again. In my mind, and this is the way I always chant it, more forcefully, because it seems like maybe Abraham was in such a frenzy that he couldn't listen, he couldn't hear, and so even though God was calling him, he didn't hear him. And so God calls Abraham, and then a second time, much more forcefully, Abraham. And so it's just a very good example of that. The land shall observe a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth. But I want to just jump ahead one verse, verse 6. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle may eat the yield from the land. What are we talking about here? You can't plant, you can't harvest, but
you can eat. Everybody can share equally in whatever grows wild.
Right, it's the wild growth, right? In other words, if you've ever planted a garden, right, you know that you plant certain things, but if you do it in the same place every year, sometimes stuff pops up that you didn't plant this year. It just, you didn't plant it, it just grew. That's perfectly permissible to eat. And so you can go out and you can eat that, but it just has to be the natural growth. Okay.
Rabbi, isn't it interesting, at least to me, that there's no comment about storing food in advance for that time? Especially these are people who just came out of Egypt, the whole story of Joseph, and the whole storage of food. So it's I don't know, Rabbi, say anything about that? Like, you're not supposed to do that.
So, we're gonna jump ahead. I was gonna get to that, but you asked, and so now we're gonna talk about that because, let's just jump ahead for a second. We didn't quite get to it. Let's read and then, but hold, I'm gonna come back to
I'll
that in
hold it
just
with
a
Ron's
minute.
thoughts, too.
You shall count off, because the question you're raising gets even more pronounced after the next few verses. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years. In other words, this is the 7-year sabbatical period. And then doing that 7 times in a row brings you to year 50. So that a period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Then you shall sound the horn loud in the 7th month on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement, which of course is right, that's Yom Kippur. You shall have the horn sounded throughout your year, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim, I'm gonna read this in Hebrew first, verse 10. V'kidashtem et shnat hachamishim shana ukaratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha. And you shall proclaim release or liberty throughout the land. I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia. One of the things we did on a school field trip, it seems like we went every year, we probably didn't, but it seemed like it, was to go to the Liberty Bell. This is the verse inscribed on the Liberty Bell. You shall proclaim, it's there, it says liberty, but liberty in the sense of release. You shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, a yovel in Hebrew. And notice, by the way, linguistically, jubilee comes directly from the Hebrew. Yovel, yud, the root, yud, beit, lamed. Yud for a Y or J sound, bet for a B sound, L for the lamed for the L sound. So JBL, all you have to do is put some vowels in and we get to Jubilee. There's a wonderful book written by a public school teacher of Hebrew, either in Brooklyn or the Bronx years ago, Edward Horowitz. Do we have an Edward Horowitz? There we go. I don't know if he's a relative. He is?
Yeah.
Oh, he wrote a wonderful book called How the Hebrew Language Grew. And it's even if you're not a Hebrew speaker, it's still a very interesting book.
We're all hugging, Terry, because her husband just died.
Yes.
Just buried him, so. Just to explain it to those who don't understand what all the hugging.
Gotcha, yes. Share our condolences. And just a moment ago, gotcha. Just a moment ago, I mentioned the reading of the Akedah. And of course, as I was telling the story, I was thinking about Eric, because at Bethenu, he would come every year and chant the Akedah for us on second day. And he was a wonderful, wonderful person. Blessed memory. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to his holding, and each of you shall return to his family. The 50th year shall be a jubilee. You shall not sow, neither shall you reap. It shall be holy to you. You may eat only the growth direct from the field. So this brings me back to Bill's question. The sabbatical year and the jubilee year, I want to say a few things about them. It seems, and the commentaries talk about this in detail, that the impulse for the sabbatical and ultimately the jubilee year is to prevent generational and perpetual poverty and oppression. Now that is a wonderful goal that the Torah strives for. In other words, in 50th year, slaves were released. And the land in the sabbatical year was allowed to lie fallow. And everybody had access to whatever grew wild. I mean, there's a very communitarian, egalitarian spirit in the Torah. Nowhere expressed better than in the sabbatical and jubilee year, which is really the focus of this week's parsha. That's a wonderful idea, that every 7 years, the land gets to, it happens to be good farming practice too. But the land gets to lie rest. Everybody has access to whatever they can find growing wild. And then in the 50th year, land that was purchased reverts back to its original owner. And slaves were released. Loans were forgiven. There was manumission of slaves and there was debt remission. This sounds so wonderful, but it brings us to Bill's problem. How do you feed a community for a year if all you can do is eat what grows wild, if they're relying on the farmer? And if you think that's a problem, which it is, now what do you do with the Yovel year? Because the 50th year always comes after the 49th year, which is in itself a sabbatical. Now we have 2 years. In terms of debt remission in Jubilee and sabbatical years, if I'm down on my luck and I need to borrow money, I have to find somebody that'll lend me money. Now, it was a difficult enough system because Israelite to Israelite, you couldn't collect interest. So that was like, lending money to family, which is always 100% of the time a bad idea, right? Unless you're willing to give up the money. Right, if you can spare the money, you don't need it back, take care of your family all you can. We're gonna get to that when we talk about tzedakah in a minute. But otherwise, not such a good idea. So you couldn't collect interest, but more than that, okay, in the 7-year cycle, so year 1 or 2, I need to borrow money. All right, I'll borrow it. Somebody will lend it to me and I'll get, and they'll collect over the next few years as I repay the debt, right? But if I have access, if I have the ability to lend money to someone and they come to me in year 6, am I gonna lend them money knowing that in a matter of months that debt's gonna be forgiven? In year 5, I'm gonna be reluctant. In year 4, I'm gonna be on the fence. In other words, it's a great idea, but you can't sustain an economic system this way. And that's true for the sabbatical year and even more intensely true with the Jubilee year, right? Who would possibly buy land at the end of the 50-year cycle if I know it's going to revert back to its original owner? So to me, I appreciate the impulse and the value the Torah is getting at. But we have to look at this and see that it's just impractical.
What happened though in fact? I mean, the law still applies now.
Well, let's leave your last comment out of it because there's a lot of debate about whether the law still applies now, even in the land of Israel. Certainly, it only applies in the land of Israel. But the question is,
That does apply.
what's that?
The Shmita still applies.
For most people, but there's not 100% agreement on that. As the worldwide Orthodox population has turned rightward religiously, Shemitah has taken on a universal observance in the land of Israel. But if you historically look, there have been, including today, but particularly historically, long periods of time where since the destruction of the Second Temple, Shemitah was not observed in the land of Israel. So that's that, but let's leave that aside because it doesn't answer your original question, which is what happened. We're not so sure what happened exactly in biblical times. We know that in the rabbinic period, of course, the Bible comes to a close, the Torah comes to a close with the death of Moses approximately. You've heard me say this before, I'm always suspicious of all population sizes, genealogies, dates, ages, etc. in the Torah, but for the sake of argument, roughly around 1200 BCE, Moses dies, the Torah narrative comes to an end, the story of the prophets and kings picks up, and then we have the remainder of the Bible the Hebrew Bible, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim sections, the prophets and the writings, which come to a close somewhere in the 3rd to 4th century BCE for the most part, right? So we have about another 1,000 years, not quite, of biblical, and then we begin the rabbinic period, which is neatly divided into the early and late rabbinic period, not our ancestors' best work, but okay. And of course, Hillel in the 1st century, the great sage Hillel, comes up with what some have called a workaround. Others have called less friendly a loophole. And that was the Prose Bowl, which I'm going to get to you in a second, I promise, which basically in regard to land ownership and remission of debts, these rules applied to private sales and private lending. And so a legal document was attached to the sale, which was submitted to the Beit Din. And so now the sale was in essence a sale involving, not so much through, but involving the Beit Din, which made it a public communal sale, which was not subject to the laws of remission of debts or returning of land. This was the great Prose Bowl of Hillel, which allowed them to work around this. Now, we actually have a very commonly used, lest that sound like, how could they do that? It's a Torah law. It's, you just can't go modify. We actually have a very well-known, fully accepted, for the most part,
Fully for the most.
practice that does the same thing in our everyday lives for those that are Shabbat observant in a halachic way. And that is the Eruv. You cannot go from a private to a public domain on Shabbat. You can't carry from a private to a public domain. You can't, if you live outside the Eruv, you can't carry your talis to synagogue. The Eruv, let me define it, probably everybody knows, but in case you don't, the Eruv creates, takes a private domain and expands it. And we do this by creating some kind of barrier, which in most communities is a wire, which goes around utility poles and extends your private domain. And it has to be intact. There's a lot of rules about it. It has to be intact, has to be checked every week before Shabbos. And we enlarge the private domain and create a large private domain, which is covered by the entire area of the Eruv. And now I can carry and move around and there's no problem because it's all an extent, essentially a public domain, but it's all essentially an enlarged private domain, right? Cleveland has an Eruv. Is B'nai Yeshurun in the Eruv?
It stops on the other side.
It's at Shari Tikva, right? Because Shari Tikva didn't used to be in the Eruv, and there were a half a dozen families who worked with the Eruv committee to expand it. What was the motivation for that? Anybody know? I happen to know this because
We're not in it?
no. Why half a dozen families at Shari Tikva? They had observant
They
children.
thought would come.
They wanted to be able to come for Simchas. Let's make it more friendly.
But they wanted to include their own.
No, right,
Ainsley
right.
and
It got expanded, but
Orthodox, and they were
Right.
moving Boulevard.
right, but
And they.
the expansion was right. Right, but the expansion was led by a few families at Shari Tikva.
Let that go, though. Observance is relative. So I don't prefer to use the word observant because I have Orthodox friends who keep less kosher, quote unquote, than we do. So it's a relative term, and I don't like to fall for somebody else's negative description of me.
So I fully accepted. What do you use?
What do you, instead of saying that, you have another way to.
I'll just say Orthodox.
Oh, so
for
that's
example.
even harder.
But,
Harder to defend than observant, but okay.
All right, let's keep moving.
That's kind of my point anyway.
Right. So the Eruv is a workaround which Jewish communities for centuries and still today live with. And I'm gonna say two things about this in a minute. I have to remember both of them. But first, Ivan, you've been waiting.
Attention. History and politics. Trying to balance freedom and equality. I mean, you know, and some people in China back where he says that the Judaism tries to deal with this problem by saying that you can have freedom and you can have equality. You can't have them at the same time. Right? And so that's why it takes 7 years and 49, 50 years to address the inequality. But in the end, it is.
Right, this is a constant challenge, I'd say, in life, but more,
Reflected in, socialism.
right.
Capital
Well, that would,
versus private,
right.
enterprise.
What I wanted to say was that it's a constant challenge in Judaism and in Torah. Is it, does the narrative describe what is? Is it descriptive or is it aspirational? Right, and there's a tension there, and the sabbatical and jubilee year and the description of them are I think a good example of aspirational Torah, and then we have to figure out how to actually make it work. Yes.
I'll save it for later. I don't want to get off track.
Oh, okay. So the Eruv, two things I wanted to say. I said that it's widely accepted or universally accepted with some limitation. Very interestingly, and I'm not even sure of the exact reasons, but Chabad does not follow the Eruv. Chabad does not hold by the Eruv. And so that's around the world. So it's just an interesting little.
Yeah. No, and we just can't.
You can't. They don't use, the Eruv is a workaround. They do not utilize it. They absolutely don't live
On
by
the
it.
other hand, they have ones who say, you come, we don't care how you get here.
That's a different story. Yes.
Seriously.
No, I get it, but that's not the Eruv issue. Yes.
And so you brought this back around to what I wasn't gonna.
Go ahead. Spit it out then.
But I think that the struggle I have with the whole idea of the Eruv, which is quite creative, is the rabbis infer from the building of the Mishkan of all these rules for how Shabbat should be different from the rest of the week.
Right.
And then they find a community that's in such a tight box, it's just not gonna happen. This is the way it feels to me anyway. How do we possibly make it happen then? Oh, I know, we'll come up with the Eruv. So the struggle I have is if that's true, and maybe it's not, maybe I'm just reading that into something I don't particularly observe. But if it is true, I think that on the one hand, it's beautiful that how we figure out how to observe Shabbat is by inference. So it's flexible by its nature. But then when a group of people who are followed make it fairly inflexible, they have to find a way to make it flexible again.
Okay.
Because we're human beings, we have to live.
Well,
Shabbat is supposed to be beautiful, not,
Right.
you know,
So I
sit in your house and be miserable.
would say this, not by way of disagreement, but just by way of comment, that the Torah gives us a text and the fundamental principle. And this is agreed to, in my opinion, by all Jews across every spectrum. How we do it, we disagree about, but that we interpret the text to understand it That, in other words, there's nothing that says, in fact, quite opposite, it says you don't accept the Torah in its simplest, plainest, most literal way. We have to interpret it, and every community and every generation is involved in that. And so I don't think that's a weakness, by the way, of the text or of the tradition.
I agree.
And this, I mean, in law, do we have any attorneys in the room?
We do.
I mean, this is the originalist argument, you know, in regard to our courts, let's just leave it at that, between, you know, is the Constitution of the US a living, breathing document that we interpret, and or do we have to understand what did the writers of it, what did the founders mean, et cetera? So it's that same tension in play. All right, we're gonna go to Bill, because I gotta get back to one A-roof story, and then I gotta, my goal today was to get through 70% of what I prepared. We're trying to get through, I'm on track to get through.
My understanding was the original A-roof, or if you lived in a walled city, it was the walls of the city that formed that boundary, and it was a separation of the community within from whatever was going on out. And even though that extended the private to the whole community, there was a sense to that. You were all living in that walled city together. And then the extension, when we no longer have walled cities, to form that wall. But that might not be true.
That's lovely. I don't know. There's probably instances where it's accurate and others where it's not. Some of you know, I have a son and daughter-in-law and grandson who live in Jerusalem, and they are what would probably be described as modern Orthodox. And they come visit us periodically, never enough, but periodically. And you may or may not know that my daughter and son-in-law and their two children live next door to me, which is delightful. And so when my son Micah from Israel was coming a year ago, August, it was last August, he was gonna be here in Cleveland for 4 Shabbatot. He was here for, was 3.5 weeks, but it covered 4 Shabbatot, something like that. And a little bit before he came, he said, Abba, in order to go back and forth between Talia's house and our house and take food, because we eat in both houses. They have a nicer outdoor patio than we do, so we cook food at our house and take it over there. We're gonna need an A-roof. And so I called up, so I said, well, you know, this is not my area of expertise. He said, call Rabbi Blau. So I did, and I explained the situation, and he said, well, you can create an A-roof, but I can help you with that. But he said, it's not my area of expertise. I want to get Rabbi Bernstein involved. Green Road and Young Israel. And first Rabbi Blau came out and took a look at the setup and said, yeah, you can do it. I mean, there's some bushes and trees between the houses, but it's absolutely, you know, they're contiguous properties. And then I wasn't even there when Rabbi Blau and Rabbi Bernstein made a second home visit for Rabbi Bernstein to see. And then Rabbi Blau and I spoke, and he gave me instructions exactly what to buy in order to construct an A-roof. What's necessary is you need some kind of semi-permanent sticks in the ground, right? Which in this case, you could connect to a tree. And then you run a string. You put a nail on the top of it, you run a string, and the string, section to section, each pole is called a lechi, section to section, has to be straight and unbowed. That's why it has to be checked every week. Unbroken and unbowed and straight. From lechi to lechi, you can change the angle, but the string itself from one to the other has to be straight. So he came over and was gonna show us how to do that. He actually wanted to do that with us and kind of get us started. And it was very clear to me that as he was telling me what we were gonna do, because I kept wanting to get it done like before my son came, so it would be done. I think my son came on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. It has to be done by Friday, right? I wanted to get it done, but it kind of became clear to me that Rabbi Blau was putting me off just a little bit because he wanted my son involved. It's like, I'll help you build an A-roof. No, it was very nice. I'll help you build an A-roof. But it'd be nice to have a frum Jew involved in this, you know? So he came over, and Rabbi Blau came over. He's gonna help us put it up on Thursday. He got us started, but he could only stay for 5 minutes. That was, if you remember, last summer, there was a week-long blackout.
Oh, yeah.
And this was the Thursday of that blackout, and they were in a panic because they get huge numbers of people to synagogue Friday night and Saturday morning. And they couldn't use their building and they had no refrigeration. And so he said, I don't have time to hang out with you for a couple hours, but he got us started. And we built the A-roof and we had a kosher A-roof. What I learned is the A-roof actually is not the barrier and the string. You have to put food. You have to take two types of food, declare that it's going to be for public consumption, put that in one of the houses, and there's a bracha you make. Of course there's a bracha you make, right? And then that actually is the act which creates the A-roof. We do the same thing before Pesach. We did it this year. If Pesach falls, what was it? If Seder falls on a Saturday night, you need to make an A-roof for cooking before Yom Tov starts, right? It's the same principle. Okay, we're gonna move on because we're doing way too much time on this. Now, what did I give you in my packet? Hang on a minute, because I brought a copy of it. Hang on. Okay. So, yeah, okay. I want to comment, this is from Rabbi Tali Adler, who teaches at Hadar in New York. And if you're not familiar with Hadar, you should familiarize yourself. They put out a lot of very good material. Every Shabbos, there's a Devar Torah, I think often more than one. They put out holiday material for the high holy days and the festivals. And they're a wonderful organization.
Online Parsha class on Thursday afternoon.
Thank you. And she's one of their teachers. I don't know if this is full-time for her or what she does, what else she does. But she's commenting on this return of land and really also of slaves. And she writes, when it comes to the enslavement of Jews, God gives us two imperatives. Because remember here, we're talking about Israelites having other Israelites as their, what we call slaves. To me, it's useful to think of this, I want to be clear, it's an oppressive system, but it's, I think, more useful to think of biblical slavery in this regard as more like an indentured servitude than a slavery of African Americans in this country. In other words, because the Israelite slave owner did have obligations to their slaves. And the slaves had certain types of rights, for lack of a better term, in terms of keeping families intact and so on. So, right. So it's, and I don't want to be an apologist for biblical slavery because it's problematic. It's a very difficult area of Torah. But I think it's useful to understand it more as a kind of form of indentured servitude, which in itself is problematic. When it comes to enslavement of the Jews, God gives us two imperatives. First, strive to be like God. In other words, in how we treat them, right? Failing that, resist the temptation to become like the Egyptians. Ultimately, we fail at both. The striving to be like God is in regard to how we treat them, and that ultimately they are redeemed in the Jubilee year, right? And not becoming like the Egyptians is specifically about not treating them harshly, right? We have that word in the, I quoted here in Leviticus 25 later on, do not rule them harshly. But fear your God. That harshly in the Hebrew in the Exodus story is Pharaoh worked the slaves bifarech, right? Cruelly, harshly, right? And there's a wonderful midrash that it plays on the word befarech, beperach, with gentle speech. What does that mean? The midrash on that is that Pharaoh went down to the Israelite slaves and said, I'm gonna work with you today. And he worked with them. There was a camaraderie between Pharaoh and the slaves. And he worked with them. And of course, when he's working with them and he's working hard, and you're working with the Pharaoh, with the king, you're gonna put in your best day's work. And you're gonna work hard, you're gonna be industrious, you're gonna skip the breaks. Right? And Pharaoh worked with them for the day. Their production was way up. You employ people, you know how this works, right? And their production was way up. And then Pharaoh said, okay, I'm only working with you for one day, but what you did today, good for you, that's your daily quota, right? That's the midrash is one of the midrash's way, one of the ways the midrash understands befarech. He spoke to them kindly, he worked alongside them, and then used their own good work to punish them. Right? So befarech, okay. And then she goes on to go to the bottom paragraph. The commandment is both a dream and a warning. A dream that once given power, we can avoid becoming like those who once exercised it over us. The very fact that we need to be commanded, however, warns us that there is nothing natural or easy about that stance. We must be vigilant if we want to avoid becoming Egyptians ourselves. What is it? Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? It is very hard when you wind up in a position of, in this example, of kind of socioeconomic superiority, not to somehow lord it over. And I don't know if any of you were at the White House dinner for the big investors the other night. But but if you want to, I couldn't help but notice that was this week's, that took place during this week's Parsha, right? I mean, that was such a clear example of what we're talking about here, right? Okay.
I'm gonna take our president's Athens aphorism on his wall. More just.
So the Torah is recognizing, and I learned a wonderful principle in law, but really I learned it in the context of Torah study from my professor, Jonathan Sarna, who some of you probably know of or know. And he just retired from teaching at Brandeis. He's still there, but he retired. They had a big gala for him a week and a half ago. What he said is that one of the principles in Torah study is that if the Torah forbids something, you can guarantee that people were doing it. Because if people aren't doing it, there's no need to forbid it, right? And so this idea that we can't become cruel overseers is there because that's so easy for it to happen. And
learn more history, world history, from all these negative things that.
okay,
Yeah, Judaism has done a lot, like Rashi, for example. I know it's slightly off topic, but Rashi talks about, he translates words into French, and it's Old French. And we now know how to pronounce some of those words because of Rashi.
right. I want to move on to rooted in the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and the Yovel, the Jubilee year, and the forgiveness of debts. In this is, of course, how we treat one another in society, how we protect the less fortunate, the needy, the impoverished, that whatever, these words are always very tricky, right? We don't talk about homeless people anymore. We talk about unhoused for a variety of reasons, because if you don't have a house to live in, wherever you live is your home, so we don't talk about homeless, right? No, that's when somebody's homeless. I don't know, I'm not completely convinced by that argument, but but I was corrected in another presentation about that not so long ago, so I'm sensitive to it now. And this goes back to what I said earlier about the Torah's egalitarian, communitarian spirit. And I just want to touch on that this is not directly addressing, but certainly is adjacent and connected to the giving of tzedakah and how we care for those in our community. Now, we would say, and here we're talking about any, tzedakah as any charitable act we do, but we're specifically in this instance talking about some kind of either monetary or some way in which we are providing basic needs to people that otherwise don't have access to them, right? Which often involves fiscal charity. It's a wonderful idea. The minute we bring it up and want to do it, we're faced with the issue of, okay, how do we do it? And is there any prioritization? And the Shulchan Aruch addresses that. This is the great codes from the Middle Ages, right? So we're moving into 500 years ago instead of 2,000 years ago. But of course, it's based on earlier text. And this is on the comment from in 25:25 that we read. I think we read it. If we didn't get to it, then we could have. When your kin is in distress and sold some of their property, the closest relatives of theirs comes and redeems the sale of their kin. I'm on page. Is this in your? Yeah, it is. Thank you. The Shulchan Aruch says, the poor of your city take precedence over the poor of another city. The needy of Israel receive priority over the poor of the diaspora. Obligations to local resident poor, precede those owed to transient poor who have just come into the city. One's impoverished family members come before another poor person. We have to think about giving tzedakah in a priority order of concentric circles, starting with closest and then reaching out. But even that has to be divided between closest in the Jewish community versus the non-Jewish community, closest vis-a-vis Israel versus diaspora. So these are concentric circles, but in some ways there's a certain overlap. Is there a mathematical term for that? It's kind of like a Venn diagram.
Mishmash.
A mishmash, maybe it's a mishmash, a name for Professor Bagel. And your own kin, your own family, they take precedence. Brings us back to our earlier discussion about lending money to family. Yes.
There are nowadays charity collecting organizations. .org, not .com, that collect your donation and they distribute it among 75 different
Right.
charity organizations that they know of and they know about that need help.
Right.
But this charity organization takes your money, they don't take anything for them, and they distribute it.
Right.
It's called daily giving. Daily giving.
Right.
You contribute $1 per day. One, not more.
$1 a day. Gotcha.
$30
So-
a month, and they distribute it, and every day we get an email.
Right, right.
$1.
These are,
Charity organization.
this is essentially a type of tzedakah collective.
Right.
In various forms. It's been around certainly in the Jewish community for, hundreds and hundreds of years.
Okay, that's what federation is.
And what I was gonna say is that is the foundation for the federation system. And in case you were wondering, if you would like to give to them daily, they would be perfectly okay with that. But yes, and of course, the federation system of collective giving and then distribution is rooted, right, we're gonna get to that in a second, is rooted in the, the way that diaspora Jewry in Europe was organized for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then there was essentially a Jewish corporation that ran the community. And they collected money and they distributed it. And so it's a little bit different, but same principle. So want to get to that. So you start with your own family. And then you work out to the people in your city. And then the people in your city who live there permanently and are impoverished receive precedence over the wandering beggar, right? For lack of a better term, who comes, right? And there's a whole genre of stories and jokes about schnorrers in, European Jewry. And, and Beechwood, yeah. But you know about the schnorrer who every year, once a year, would come to Rothschild. And Rothschild would give him 30 rubles. It's a very generous gift. And he comes one year to Rothschild and Rothschild gives him 5 rubles. And the guy looks at the 5 rubles and looks at Rothschild. And he said, well, what gives? And Rothschild says, I didn't have a good year. And the beggar looks at him and says, you had a bad year, I should suffer. And then there's the story of Rothschild shows up at the inn and he's hungry and he orders a meal, he serves the meal. And, normally it would cost a few kopecks and instead the innkeeper says, that meal is 25 rubles. I said, godly, it's a fortune in money. And Rothschild looks at the innkeeper and says, are these kinds of meals so rare that they cost so much? And innkeeper says, no, but Rothschilds are. And Jeffrey Salkin wrote in the same book I mentioned earlier, while the expression charity begins at home is not a Jewish one, it might be. However, Judaism would add, so long as it doesn't end at home. That's the point, right? And we know that in Judaism, I want to go through one more thing about tzedakah and then one more thing, and then we're gonna have to wrap it up. And then I didn't even come close to getting through 70%.
Maybe it was 7%.
Wait a minute, I lost my point. In the prioritization of giving, Maimonides, codified might be a little bit too strong of a word, but Maimonides suggested 8 rungs on a ladder of tzedakah, beginning at the bottom. Yes, beginning at the bottom and working up, right? It's always a question when you make this into a graphic. Do you start at the top and work down, or do you do it the other way, right? Because is the highest level the 8th level or the 1st level is what I'm getting at. So, and his categories are not mutually exclusive. So you're gonna hear them, I'm gonna go through them quickly, you're gonna hear them, you're gonna say, well, some of them kind of overlap, they're not, that's okay, don't worry about that. And Maimonides, of course, we're going back before Shulchan Aruch, another almost 500 years. We're going back nearly 1,000 years to Maimonides. The lowest level, now I wanna be clear, the lowest level of giving is still good. You're giving. In other words, did you fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah? Yes. Even if you do it at the lowest level, you have given tzedakah. In other words, I want to be clear, it's still praiseworthy. And that level is to give when donations are given grudgingly. This is when whoever has your federation card calls you and you say, okay. And some years my increase is quite modest, and I mean quite modest. But I give a small increase because I don't want anyone to be able to say, yeah, he gave, but he gave grudgingly. You figure. What's that?
Yeah.
I'm not making pennies. A wise guy, that's what you are. So when you give, but you give grudgingly, The next level up, when one gives less than he should, but does so cheerfully. So I'm happy to give, but I give less than I'm able to. Right? This is the development director's nightmare. And today they have all kind of euphemistic language, right? This is, what is that person's capacity? Their capacity, right? Like it's their stomach and they're eating, right? The next, when one gives directly to the poor upon being asked. So you've been asked, right? And then you give directly to the poor. Now, in some ways, what you describe accomplishes that. And in other ways, it doesn't. It depends on the organization, right? And again, I want to be clear, there's two kinds of giving here. And I want to draw a dichotomy between them. They're both good, but I want to at least acknowledge that there's two kinds of giving. One is to give charity to help people meet their basic needs. And the other is to be philanthropic, to do things that improve quality of life and the community. Both are good, both are important, but giving money to the university to build a better library is different than feeding someone, you know, in the church basement at, 65th and Euclid, whatever, right? I don't know if there's a church there or not. If there is a church there, probably used to be a synagogue. We have to understand that those are two different things. They're both important. Judaism promotes both, to be clear about that. There's one type of giving which absolutely has to go to the poor to meet their basic needs in Jewish tradition. A mandated giving of tzedakah that has to go to the poor. And it is, you all know it and you don't realize it. And I'll bet almost everybody here does it. Not Shalach Manot, but you got the right holiday. In addition to Shalach Manot, which is gifts to friends, giving charity to the giving tzedakah on Purim has to be to the poor. That is mandated, right? That can't be for some other person. It has to go. Hold on one second, Bijan. Where am I here? So that was number 6, right? Number 8, when give grudgingly. 6 gives directly to the poor upon being asked. The next one, not going to surprise you, when one gives directly to the poor without being asked. I understand that there's people in my community in need. Nobody has to ask me. I'm going to just proactively give. Next level, donations when the recipient is aware of the donor's identity, but the donor still doesn't know the specific identity of the recipient. Now we're getting into issues of human dignity. If I'm the giver, but I don't know who it's going to, but the person receiving knows where it came from, in some ways, we've created a disconnect which protects everyone's feelings. But in that instance, it really protects the donor more than the recipient. And that's going to bring us to the next level up. Donations when the donor is aware to whom the charity is being given, but the recipient is unaware of the source. We know that people have funny feelings and are squeamish about accepting charity. It's a hard thing to do to accept. Forget about just charity. In all of our lives, sometimes we need help from other people. And it is often, despite that we need it and that we know we need their help and support, we are reluctant to accept it.
I'm sorry, it's better not to call it Mandel food drive or,
Yes,
not
it's
to
better
put a
not to
name,
have
not-
your name
not
on it.
Have your name on something like that, I guess.
Well, hang on a minute. Hold on to that
Hold on
thought.
to that.
Anyway, they wouldn't do food drive. They only build,
They only build
buildings, right? And thank God they do. I want to be clear, and thank God they do. Including that my son works for the Mandel Foundation at Jerusalem, so I'm a big believer in the Mandel Foundation. So people are squeamish about accepting charity. So here, the donor knows where it's going, but the recipient doesn't. And that's going to lead us to our next obvious level, giving assistance in such a way that the giver and recipient are unknown to each other. Communal funds administered by responsible people are also in this category. This is the federation system. This is the tzedakah collective model that you're talking about, right? And ideally, we give, what gets donated, what gets given is also fully distributed. What you're describing, it sounds like there's no overhead, if that's possible. The federation system, there is a small, despite the number of staff they seem to have, it is in the grand scheme of things, a very low overhead operation.
There's also this concept of feed someone a fish and you would have to feed him for the rest of his life, as opposed to teach him how to. That
Okay,
is how organizations in Europe
right.
have come up with the idea, instead of them helping all kinds of communities, Jewish communities all around the world, they started to build for them schools.
You read my mind. Maimonides' top level of giving. The highest form of charity is to help sustain a person before they become impoverished by offering a substantial gift in a dignified manner, or by extending a suitable loan, or by helping them find employment or establish themselves in business so as to make it unnecessary for them to become dependent on others. Right? Now, what's not addressed here is your question of anonymity, and with that, we really are gonna have to stop. There is great debate. There is not one opinion in Judaism about this. Because we recognize that you expand opportunities for giving if in some way people receive some credit for it. Look around any organization, any synagogue, and you're gonna find plaques in all kinds of different places, right? There's probably some in this room. I know, we're out of time. We're over time.
You can.
Good morning and good Shabbos, Rabbi Foster. So the question of anonymity, I think, remains an open debate. I'm not gonna take a side. I think there are times where it's perfectly appropriate and beautiful. I think there are times when it's done in a less tasteful manner. I will say this on this particular subject, which is that while I appreciate the naming of buildings, et cetera, for generous and wonderful donors, you can't help but notice, if you read the Jewish news, that there's a rather select and small number of, in my opinion, of individuals and families who seem to receive repeated honors in the community for their good works. And I'm glad for their good works, and I'm glad they're honored. It would be nice if we could expand the recognition a little bit. When I was a synagogue rabbi and would get invitations to all of these events, I eventually said to my administrative assistant, don't keep giving me these until my name is the honoree, right? I thought, then let me know about that one. But short of that, it's enough already. So this is tension in the Jewish community. I grew up in a synagogue. We joined when I was in sixth grade. We belonged to a different synagogue before that. And when I was in middle school, which we call junior high, the synagogue raised money and built a beautiful new building. The synagogue was growing and expanding. And that was great, and it was a nice building. And when I was in high school, they essentially sold the naming rights to the sanctuary. And I understand it, and lots of synagogues do it. But I do remember my feelings as a high schooler when you're looking for ways in which adults are being, hypocritical and immoral, because that's what teenagers do. I remember that my dis-ease.
McDonald's Sanctuary didn't do it.
We didn't even get to Bechukotai, so be it. Everybody have a